Good evening. From Carroll County Public Library, I'm Lisa Picker. On behalf of A Likely Story Bookstore and CCPL, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our program this evening. We'd like to thank our co-hosts, the Historical Society of Carroll County and the Union Mills Homestead. We'd also like to show our appreciation to our promotional partners, Howard County Library System, Talbot County Free Library, and Worcester County Library. John Cribb, who has written about subjects ranging from history to education. His previous work includes co-authoring the American Patriots Almanac and The Educated Child, which were both New York Times bestsellers. He co-edited The Human Odyssey, a 3-volume world history text, and developing online history courses. His writing has been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, National Review Online, and several other publications. During the Reagan administration, he worked at the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. A native of Spartanburg, South Carolina, John studied literature at Vanderbilt University. He serves on the Board of Trustees of Spartanburg County Public Libraries and the Board of Directors of the Hub City Writers Project, an award-winning publisher of Southern fiction and nonfiction. Tonight, our author will present, and then he will be interviewed by Jane Sewell. Since 2000, Jane has been the executive director of the Union Mills Homestead, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation and restoration of the Union Mills Homestead, which was the original home of the Shriver family going back to 1797. And site of both the Union and Confederate encampment of troops on the way to the Battle of Gettysburg. When I was thinking about who to get to interview John, Jane came to mind immediately. Jane, along with her daughter, has been a long time attendee of our author events, but this will be her first time as an interview, and we all know she will be brilliant. We'll be streaming to several social channels tonight. If you have a question or comment for our author, please type it in the comments section, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of our chat. Please look for the link to buy Old Abe from A Likely Story in the comments. And now, please join me in giving a hearty Carroll County welcome to John Cribb.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. I really appreciate you're having me here this evening from South Carolina. And as Lisa said, I am on the board of directors or board of trustees of our county library system here in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is a lot of fun. It lets me spend time with some librarians and get to know them. And I'm a huge fan of libraries. I spent a lot of my youth growing up in the library, and my wife and I made sure that our 2 daughters, when they were growing up, spent a lot of time in the library, and they did. And the idea for my novel, Old Abe, was actually born here in our library. And I turned to the library for a good bit of our research. So I'm a big fan of libraries. Anyway, I love talking to people about Lincoln, as you will figure out, I think, as I talk. And I wrote my novel, Old Abe, because I do love Lincoln. I want others to know him and hopefully love him as I do. And I'll tell you a little bit about the novel in a minute. But I thought that since we're coming down the home stretch of this kind of wild and woolly presidential campaign, which has been interesting to say the least, we could maybe take a break from 21st century politics for a few minutes and talk about 19th century politics and Lincoln's run for the presidency in 1860, 160 years ago now. So I'm going to try to get us over into, I've got some PowerPoint slides. So I'll show you if I can get it to work while I'm talking. So I'm assuming you see a screen with a big kind of flag that says for President Abraham Lincoln. If you're not seeing that, Lisa, you can jump in and I guess halt me or help me correct it. But you'll notice that Lincoln's name, his first name is misspelled here. It says Abram. Lincoln was such a dark horse candidate that unexpected candidate for the Republican nomination. When he was first nominated, people weren't even sure how to spell his name. Even his supporters misspelled his name. They eventually figured it out and got it right. But they started out, as you can see, kind of unsure who he was. All right. So at any rate, I think we all know that Lincoln was born in a log cabin in 1809 in Kentucky. And then when he was about 8 years old, his family moved across the Ohio River into southern Indiana, and they settled down in a tiny little settlement called Little Pigeon Creek, just about 15 or 20 miles from the Ohio River. And that's where Lincoln did most of his growing up. And even though he grew up out in the middle of nowhere, Lincoln, he really was exposed to politics from an early age, because even though they didn't have they didn't have TV, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have these, cell phone screens that we stare at all day. He, believe it or not, in their spare time, people actually talked to each other, and they would swap news, and newspapers would float through the area, and they might have been weeks old by the time they got out to the frontier, but they were still news to those folks, and they would swap the news with each other, and they would read newspapers to each other. And the newspapers had, they were filled with political stories and articles, and they carried speeches by people like Andy Jackson and Henry Clay. So Lincoln grows up exposed to politics. When he is about 21 years old, his family moves again, this time across the Wabash River into Illinois. He ends up in a tiny little frontier village called New Salem, Illinois, just west of Springfield. And there are a lot of famous stories about Lincoln. He's a clerk at a general store. That on your left there is a reconstruction of the store he had with a partner named Bill Berry. And he's a village postmaster. He's a surveyor. This is where he begins to study law on his own. There he is on the right, riding along the prairies, studying a law book. And he also goes into politics here in New Salem, this little village, which has about 100 people in it, which is about the size of Chicago at the time, believe it or not. But some friends in New Salem talk him into running for the state legislature in 1832. So he runs for the state legislature. It's a good way for a young man to rise in the world. So he accepts this challenge. He runs for the state legislature. He loses his first election in 1832, but he's not going to give up. He's not going to give up that easily. So he runs again in 1834. This time he is elected, and he ends up spending 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature. In 1837, he moves yet again across. This time he moves right up the road to Springfield, Illinois, which is the brand new capital of Illinois. And this is where he meets and courts and marries Mary Todd Lincoln, there on the left, and they raise a family. And he serves in the state legislature. That's the old state capitol there up on the upper right, where Lincoln was in the state house. And this is where he becomes a very successful attorney over time, and he also rises in the world of politics. In 1846, he runs for Congress and wins, and he spends 1 term in the House of Representatives in Washington. That's the only time Lincoln spent an elected office at a national level before he was president, just that 1 term in Congress. So he does that, and then he comes back to Illinois. And for the next several years, he doesn't hold elected office. He has a hand in politics, but he's not in office. And I'm not really sure he ever expected to be in office again. He's, very busy raising his family and building up this law practice. But all that changes in 1854, because in 1854, Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And if you think back to your days of history classes and history textbooks, you might remember that's a law that opened the door for slavery to spread out of the South and into the Western territories and even up into the North. That really alarms a lot of people, including Lincoln. So he jumps back into politics, and he runs for the Senate from Illinois in 1854, the U.S. Senate. He loses that election, but 4 years later, he runs again in 1858 for the U.S. Senate. And he runs against Stephen Douglas of Illinois. And this 1858 Senate race is the race of the famous Lincoln Douglas debates. Lincoln and Stephen Douglas crisscrossing the state of Illinois, 7 debates in 7 different towns. They're debating the great issues of the day, especially slavery. Lincoln loses this election for the Senate too, but these debates are so good and so interesting, so fascinating that a lot of newspapers around the country cover them, and they carry articles about them, and they print excerpts of them. And in some cases, they reprint the whole debates. So it really raises Lincoln's name recognition to a national level that he's never known before. So as I say, Lincoln loses this election in 1858 for the Senate. Later on that year, he is in Bloomington, Illinois, on legal business, and he runs into a friend of his named Jesse Fell. Jesse Fell is a fellow attorney, a political ally, a businessman, and he grabs Lincoln and he pulls him aside. He says, "Come here, Lincoln, I want to talk to you." And he takes him into his brother's law office and he sits him down and he says, "I've been traveling back east. Everybody's talking about these great debates that you had with Stephen Douglas, and I think you ought to think about running for president." And Lincoln's reaction is, "You are nuts." He says, "Nobody's going to vote for me for president." That's what he says. I'm not sure if that's what he really thinks, but that's what he says. But Jesse Fell says, "Wait a minute. Think about it. You're a man of the people, born in a log cabin, self-made man. You've had these great debates with Douglas, taken a good, strong stand against slavery. I think you ought to think about running for president." So Lincoln does begin to think about it. And as he says, "The taste is in my mouth a little," is the way that he puts it. "The taste is in my mouth a little." So he begins to send out letters to friends and supporters to kind of, gauge interest, build support. He travels to New York City, gives a big speech on slavery at Cooper Union in New York City, which is well received. And he travels up through New England on a speaking tour to raise his profile there. And then he comes back to Illinois. So that brings us to May of 1860, which is where my novel, Old Abe, begins, because in that month, in May of 1860, the Republicans of Illinois hold a state convention in Decatur to decide who they would like to see be the Republican nominee for president that year. And they meet in a temporary kind of makeshift convention hall that they put up with a few sticks of timber, and they rent a circus tent for a roof. They call it the wigwam, is what it's called. And a couple thousand guys cram in there and to choose Illinois' man that they would like to see be the Republican nominee. And when they meet, the day when they decide to do this, that Lincoln is at the back of the hall, back of the wigwam, and they pick him up and they hoist him up with their hands over their heads, and they pass him hand to hand over that sea of heads, kind of like they used to do with people at football games, at football stadiums. They would pass people up, through the crowd over the stadium. They pass them up over the crowd, over the sea of heads, and they set him down on that stage up front. And everybody's screaming and yelling and hooping and hollering. And then the crowd parts, and these two guys come walking up down the middle, and each of them is holding in their hands upright a fence rail, an old fence rail. And between these two fence rails is stretched this banner that reads, "Abraham Lincoln, the rail candidate for president in 1860." And one of these guys is Lincoln's cousin, John Hanks. And when Lincoln and John Hanks were younger men, they spent a lot of time out on the Illinois frontier, splitting hundreds and hundreds of logs to make split rails for split rail fences. And the Republicans have gone out and dug up a couple of these old rails, and they've made this campaign banner out of them. So they come marching up to the front of the hall, and everybody's yelling, and they start yelling at Lincoln. They start yelling, "Identify your work! Identify your work!" And Lincoln looks at these fence rails and he says, "I'm not sure I can. They don't look like they're a credit to their maker." And the crowd yells, "Identify your work!" And Lincoln says, "Well, boys, it may be that I split these rails many years ago. I can only say I split a lot better looking ones in my day." And everybody screams and yells and throws their hats into the air. And they proceed to name Abraham Lincoln as the man that Illinois would like to see become the Republican nominee for president. So when the state convention in Decatur is over, Lincoln and a handful of advisors, they walk over to a patch of woods nearby, and they just sprawl out on the ground under these trees, and they begin to strategize, because the Republican National Convention is just 1 week away. And it's going to be right up the road in Chicago, right in Lincoln's backyard. And the interesting thing is that the Democratic Party is expected to split over the issue of slavery, because Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats have some differences about how to handle that issue. So everybody is expecting the Democrats to split, which means whoever gets that Republican nomination is likely to become the president of the United States. However, there are a handful of guys that are considered the leading candidates to get that Republican nomination, and unfortunately, Lincoln is not one of them. The leading candidate is William Henry Seward of New York. He had been governor of New York and a senator from New York, and he really is considered, the man who is expected to get the nomination. But each of these other men, they each have something going against them. Either they're considered too radical to win a general election, or they've said or they've done something to make one group or another mad at them. Lincoln, on the other hand, he's not the first choice of a whole lot of people, but most of the delegates would be okay with him. They don't have anything against it. So Lincoln tells his advisors and his campaign team, he says, our strategy is going to be to give offense to no one. He says, leave them in the mood to come to us should they have to give up their first love, he says. So Lincoln sends his team off to Chicago. And about a week later, the Republican National Convention opens up in Chicago. And they built an even bigger wigwam in Chicago that thousands of delegates and spectators flocked to, and they cram in there to choose the Republican nominee for president. So the day comes when they're going to vote on the nominee. Lincoln is not there. Back then, in those days, it was considered kind of ungentlemanly and crass and rude for the candidates themselves to show up at these state conventions. It was just getting your hands too dirty with politics. So Lincoln follows that tradition, and he stays away. He stays at home. So he's in Springfield the morning when they choose the nominee. He's at home. Here's the Lincoln home at 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield. It's now open to the public. You can see the ranger. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not on your screens, but here's the ranger, park ranger, walking into the Lincoln home. The next time you're in Springfield, if you haven't been there, go. It's a wonderful place. It's open to the public. But anyway, he's home in Springfield the day of the convention. Chooses the nominee. He gets up early, and he goes out to the back into the barn, and he milks the cow. He feeds the horse. He splits some wood for fire. He pumps some water out of the well and brings it into the kitchen to Mary. She gives him a quick breakfast, which he gulps down, and he walks about 8 blocks downtown to his law office, which is just off the west side of the square in Springfield. It would have been just off the right side of the picture here, which you're looking at. It's a second floor law office. So he goes up to his office, and he tries to do a little work. He tries to read some newspapers, but he's just too fidgety. He's too nervous. So he goes back downstairs. He goes outside. He walks back across the square, past the state capitol there, where he had served in the legislature, and he finds some friends who were playing a game of handball outside. It's called fives, and they're just whacking this ball up against the back of a building in an alley outside. And he joins them. They play some fives for a while. He's trying to get the anxiety out by playing handball, whacking this ball against the wall. And after a while, one of them says, Jim Conklin just got in on the night train from Chicago. Why don't you see if he's got any news for you? So he walks back across the square and finds Jim Conklin in his office. Conklin is a fellow attorney and political ally. So Lincoln goes into his office and flops down on his sofa and says, "What do you know?" And Conklin looks at him and he says, "You're going to be nominated by nightfall." And Lincoln says, "No, that's crazy talk. It's not going to happen." But he pumps him for all the information that he has, and they talk for a while. And Lincoln says, "I want to go back to my office and try to practice some law." So he goes back to his office and does his best to get some work done. And after a while, his friend E.L. Baker comes in. Baker is the editor of the Republican-leaning newspaper in Springfield, and he has with him a telegram, and that telegram has the results of the first round of ballots in Springfield as the delegates are voting for the nominee. So he hands it to Lincoln, and Lincoln looks at it, and it says, William Henry Seward of New York, who is the leading candidate, has 173 and a half delegate votes. Somebody split their vote. They got a half vote. I don't know how he did that. 173 and a half votes. Abraham Lincoln, 102. And then the other candidates had different amounts of different vote totals. Lincoln looked at it. That's about what he thought he would get on the first round of voting, the first ballot, about 100 votes. And then he had said after that, as they move to the second and third rounds, and the delegates can switch their votes to other candidates, he said my vote total will probably fall off. But he says, let's go over to the newspaper office, and maybe we'll get faster news about the next round of balloting there. So they walk back across the square toward the newspaper office, but on the way, they pass the telegraph office, and they decide to go in there. And so they go in there and wait around. And after a while, the news of the second ballot comes in over the telegraph wires. And the operator takes it down and hands it to Lincoln. And Lincoln looks down at it, and it says, William Henry Seward of New York, 184 and a half votes from the delegates. Abraham Lincoln, 181. And Lincoln looks at that in utter shock, I'm sure, because that gap between Lincoln and Seward has collapsed down to almost nothing. And so Lincoln looks at it just stunned, and he probably, thinks to himself, holy cow, I don't know how they're doing it, but my guys up there, they're twisting elbows, they're making bargains, probably making all kinds of bargains and promises they shouldn't be making, and buying and selling me all around, and they are doing it. And he looks at it and in a stunned voice says, I have no fault to find with this. I believe they might well nominate me on the next ballot. So he walks over, probably weak-kneed. He walks over with some friends to the newspaper office to wait a while longer to just kind of see what's going to happen. And more friends gather with him, and they wait nervously. And after a while, the results of the third ballot come in, and they say to Lincoln, you are nominated. We did it. Glory to God. He has been nominated by the Republican Party on the third ballot. He has won. And so everybody starts to scream and yell and hoop and holler and, slap each other on the backs, and they yell the news out the window, and people start to ring bells and, fire off guns and make a big commotion. And Lincoln, after a while, he says, well, gentlemen, there's a little woman over on 8th Street who's probably more interested in this news than I am. I think I'll walk down and tell her about it. And so he walks home to give the news to Mary that he has been nominated by the Republican Party to be the president of the United States. So the campaign moves into the general election phase. And as expected, the Democrats split. So the Republicans have nominated Lincoln. The Northern Democrats nominate his old rival from the Lincoln Douglas debates. They nominate Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Southern Democrats nominate John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. And then a third party, John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party nominates John Bell of Tennessee. So the Democrats have indeed split. Now, the campaigns back then they weren't quite like they are today. Today, usually anyway, the candidates go running all over the country giving speeches and going to fundraisers and rallies and stuff. At least when there's no coronavirus, they do, right? Back then, it was considered rude and, again, ungentlemanly and kind of crass for the candidate to be doing that. The candidates usually let surrogates go out and do that kind of campaign for them, and they stayed home in a state of dignified repose. So Lincoln decides to follow that model, that tradition. He stays in Springfield for the whole campaign. And what he does is the governor of Illinois is a guy named John Wood. He's a Republican. And so he lets Lincoln use his office at the State House, at the Capitol. And Lincoln goes there for a few hours every day. And he just throws the door open, and anybody who wants to can come see him. Journalists, politicians, farmers, shopkeepers, anybody. Then come, meet him, shake his hand, hear what he has to say, hear him tell a joke or story, give him some advice. People bring him presents. A lot of ladies knit socks for him to take to the White House that they bring him. Somebody made a whistle out of a pig's tail. They brought him. A couple of people made, whittled little statues out of fence rails to bring him. So that's pretty much what he does for just about every day of the campaign. Now, even though he doesn't go out on the campaign trail, the Republican National Party kicks up a campaign in the newspapers and magazines. That's really how the campaigns were waged for the most part, was in newspapers, because that was the cutting edge mass media of the day. So they paint this picture of Abe Lincoln, the rail splitter. That's a campaign picture there on the left. He's you know, Abe Lincoln, born in a log cabin, man of the people. He split enough rails to stretch from the North Pole to the South Pole. He's honest Abe. He's never told a lie in his life. That's some the sheet music for a campaign song there on the right. Somebody wrote for him. If you look right under his picture there, you can see he signed it. Yours truly, A. Lincoln. Now, the opposition press, as you can imagine, was not quite as flattering to him. They called him Old Ape. They said he was a second-rate bumpkin, third-rate lawyer, fourth-rate politician. Unfortunately, there were racial overtones to the campaign. They called him an African gorilla. They said he was a mulatto, that he would just destroy the white man so the black man could be free. This kind of ugliness. Now, like I said, Lincoln didn't go out on the campaign trail, but sometimes the campaign came to him. At one point, the Republicans of Illinois held a huge campaign rally. 50,000 people came from all over the state and all over the Midwest to this campaign rally. And they held a big parade that went past the Lincoln home. If you look just to the right of the doorway, you can see Lincoln in white, kind of towering there above everybody else. Some of his boys hanging out the windows up there watching the parade go by. And there were bands and glee clubs and floats. Like there was a log cabin on wheels with a guy splitting wood in the front yard. It was one of the floats that rolled by. It takes 3 hours for this parade to go past the Lincoln home. And when it's finally over, everybody went out to the fairgrounds outside of town for some speeches and a big rally. So a couple of Lincoln's friends said, let's go out and check it out. Lincoln said, okay, I'll go as long as I don't have to make any speeches. I'll go out there. So they get in a carriage and they go out there to the fairgrounds. But when they got out there, the crowd, when they discovered he was there, they got so excited they went into a frenzy and they mobbed this carriage. And there were people climbing all over the top of it, and they were trying to crawl in through the windows or was reaching through the windows to touch him and shake his hand. Somebody unhooked the horse from the carriage. They got stranded. They couldn't go anywhere. And people were pressing up against the sides of it, and people were getting mashed up against it. And somebody was going to get hurt. But after a while, some of Lincoln's friends, they got a horse, and they wedged their way through the crowd and got it up to the carriage. And they pulled him out, and they got him on the back of this horse, and they jammed their way back out through the crowd, and they get him to safety. So the big day finally arrives, November 6th, 1860. And it's the day of the general election. And Lincoln's got a pretty good idea he's going to win, because I say the Democrats are split. But, you never know what's going to happen in politics, right? We've learned that in the last few years. You just never know. So he's nervous. He's anxious. So he spends a good bit of the day up at the State House, just greeting supporters as they come by to wish him well. At one point, he goes to vote. He walks across the square to the courthouse to vote. Back then, it was considered rude for people to vote for themselves. Times have changed a little bit, right? But that was just rude. You didn't do that. So he takes the ballot and he cuts off the top part with the presidential race on it, and he throws it away, and he just votes in local elections, and he drops that in the ballot box. One point, he goes home for dinner, and then back to the State House, and then as evening comes and night begins to fall, the excitement and the crowds really begin to swell, because people know that the results are going to come in over the telegraph wires from around the country, the different states. And again, and the early returns do look good. They're reassuring, but like I say, he just doesn't know what's going to happen. Nobody knows. So after a while, he walks from the State House with some friends over to the newspaper office, smaller group of friends, to nervously wait, see what's going to happen. And sometime after midnight, the results from New York State come in, and they put him over the top in the Electoral College. Back then, you needed 152 electoral votes to win the election. Lincoln wins with 180 electoral votes. And as you can see from this map here, he does very well in the North. He sweeps the North, and he also takes the two states out west, California and Oregon. Those were the only two Western states at the time. That area in between, that gray area, that was all territories. So the people there did not vote in presidential elections. As you can see, he doesn't do too well down south. He doesn't carry a single Southern state. As a matter of fact, he doesn't get a single vote down in the deep South. And when I say he doesn't get a single vote, I don't mean he doesn't get a single electoral vote. I mean, he doesn't get a single vote from anybody down south. But that was partly because they kept his name off the ballot. You couldn't even vote for Abraham Lincoln if you wanted to down south because they kept him off the ballot. So, anyways, I say the results from New York State come in, and everybody starts to scream and yell and hoot and holla, and they again are ringing bells and firing off guns and everything. And after a while, Lincoln says, "I think I'll go home and tell Mary about it." And so he walks home and gives Mary the news. He says, "Mary, we are elected. We are elected." So he enters his transition phase. Back then, today, of course, we swear the president's in around January 21st. Back then, they did it in early March, around March 4th. So he had a little bit longer time to get ready. He stays in Springfield for his transition. And he goes to the State House many days again and just throws the door open. Anybody can come see him. Now people really want to come see him because they know he's going to be president. Now the job seekers, the office seekers come out of the woodwork. People who want to be postmasters or judges or maybe be a lighthouse keeper or something, if they're after a federal job. So they swarm all over him. They show up at his house all hours of the day. He tells Mary he has to look under the bed before he goes to bed at night to make sure they're not hiding out under the bed, waiting to ask him for a job. Unfortunately, the death threats began right away, too. Letters coming in. Rumors are swirling that he's going to be poisoned in Springfield before he can even go to Washington, or shot as soon as he gets to Washington. Letters arrive. Sometimes they're just drawings of guns or knives, probably by people who couldn't write. They just, drew a knife or a gun or something. An image comes from South Carolina that shows him with a noose around his neck, his feet in chains, his body tarred and feathered, this kind of thing. The death threats will continue right straight on through his presidency until the very end, when, of course, he is assassinated. This is the period, his transition period, where he forms that famous team of rivals cabinet, where he takes the men who ran against him for the Republican nomination, he puts them into his cabinet. And he does this for several reasons. But one is he knows that they have more governing experience than he does, and he wants to learn from them. Lincoln was a brilliant learner. He's a great reader. He's also a great talker. He's famous for telling stories and jokes, and they said he was so funny he could make a cat laugh. So he's a great talker, but he's also a great listener. And that's one way Lincoln learns, in addition to reading. He's a really great listener. And he does a brilliant job of learning on the job in Washington. So he knows how to listen to people, and so he wants to put some people into his cabinet that can help him. This is also the period where he grows his beard. We always think of Lincoln with his beard, but when he ran for presidency, he was clean shaven. But during the campaign, he gets this letter from a young girl in Westfield, New York, Grace Fidel, and she writes him and says, "All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you if you had a beard, and then you would be president." So once he's elected, he decides to take Grace's advice, and he starts to grow that beard. This image right here we're looking at, I believe that's the first photograph of Lincoln with that beard coming in there. Now, meanwhile, the South is growing increasingly alarmed over Lincoln's election. Rumors and hysteria are sweeping the South. The word is that he's an abolitionist. As soon as he gets into office, he's going to free all the slaves, make them citizens. The white people are going to have black people in their legislatures, on their juries, in their schools. And the talk of secession begins as soon as he's elected. The southern states start to talk about seceding. People hang Lincoln in effigy in a couple places in the South. They begin to wear badges and ribbons that say things like "resistance to Lincoln is obedience to God," that kind of thing. Lincoln thinks the talk of secession is just hype. It's overblown. He really misjudges the situation. He says, once I'm in office, the Southerners will figure out I'm not such a bad guy after all, and they'll learn to like me, and everything will calm down and it'll be fine. But then, of course, in December of 1860, South Carolina goes out of the Union, and other Southern states begin to follow. Southern forces around the South begin to seize federal property and federal installations. The guns in Charleston Harbor are swung around and aimed at Fort Sumter. where federal troops are garrisoned or holed up out in the harbor. In January of 1861, the Star of the West, which is a merchant vessel, tries to come into Charleston Harbor and approach the fort with supplies and reinforcements for the fort. The Southern guns in Charleston fire at it, and so it turns around and goes back out to sea. The next month, in February of 1861, Southern representatives, Southern leaders gather in Montgomery, Alabama, and there they form the Confederate States of America at the state capitol there on the left in Montgomery. They choose as their president Jefferson Davis, and they choose as their vice president Alexander Stephens of Georgia. I really should have this picture up here. Alex Stephens and Lincoln were friends. They served together in Congress. They were fellow Whigs, and Lincoln really likes Alex Stephens, and so he's very discouraged and disappointed when Stephens is offered and takes the job as vice president of the Confederacy. So suddenly, this man who has served exactly 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature and 1 term in the U.S. Congress is about to be president of the United States and face the greatest crisis that the country has ever known. So he's running out of time here, just a little bit longer before he goes to Washington, but there's still a lot to do. For one thing, he has to write his inaugural address. His brother-in-law has a dry goods store right off the town square in Springfield, and there's a vacant room above it with a desk in it. So Lincoln goes there for a couple of hours every day for a few days, and get some peace and quiet, get away from the crowds, and he can draft his inaugural address. He wants to say goodbye to his stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, also known as Sally Lincoln. She's a very important figure in Lincoln's life. Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, had died when he was about 10 years old. And so his father, Tom Lincoln, remarried. And Sally Lincoln, his stepmother, as I say, becomes a second mother to him and a really important figure in his life. She's living on a farm about 80 miles east of Springfield, where she and Lincoln's dad, Tom Lincoln, had settled down several years before. Lincoln's father has passed away now, but Sally's still out there living on the farm in Coles County, Illinois. So Lincoln takes a series of 3 trains out to see her and tell her goodbye. She had not wanted him to win the presidency. And so when he goes out to see her, she says, "Abe, I'm scared they're going to kill you and I'm never going to see you again." He says, "No, Mama, that's not going to happen." He says, "Trust in the Lord and all will be well." It is, in fact, the last time they ever see each other. She outlives him when he's assassinated in 1865. So he tells his stepmother goodbye, and then he goes back to Springfield. There's still quite a bit to do before he goes to be president. They have to figure out what to do with their house. They like their house a lot. It's a great house, and they figure we're only going to be gone for a few years, so they don't want to sell it. So they rent it out to the president of the Great Western Railroad for for $350 a year. I think was the rental price per year, not per month, per year. $350 a year. It's pretty good, right? They sell most of their furniture to neighbors and other people. They give some of it away, just kind of clear out the house. Mary Lincoln, much to the chagrin of historians today, I'm sure, she just takes a bunch of old letters and papers and stuff that she wants to get rid of. She takes them out in the back of the house and just burns them, to get rid of them. They have to decide what to do with Fido, the dog, the yellow mutt Fido that Lincoln's boys have. And Lincoln has decided Fido's not going to do too well on the train ride to Washington. So much to his boys' disappointment, he says Fido's got to stay. So they find some neighbors to take care of Fido. And so they leave their house, they clear out of their house. And the last few nights they spend in downtown Springfield in a hotel called the Chenery House in downtown. Lincoln spends his last afternoon in Springfield with his law partner, Billy Herndon. They've been partners for many years. It's been a good partnership. And so they sit down just to, kind of go over some last things and close out some matters. And then as they go outside, they go outside, and Lincoln looks up at their shingle. It says Lincoln and Herndon hanging on rusty hinges outside their door. And he tells Billy Herndon, he says, "Leave it hanging there undisturbed." He says, "If I live, I'll come back and we'll go on practicing law as if nothing ever happened." So he tells Billy goodbye, and he goes back to the Chenery House where they spend the last night in Springfield. And they get up the next morning and they put their last belongings that they need to pack into a couple of traveling trunks. And Lincoln gets some rope and he ropes them up, and he goes down to the hotel office and he gets a couple of cards that say Chenery House on them, and he flips them over onto the blank side, the back side, and he writes A. Lincoln, the Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C. on it, and he takes a hammer and he tacks them to these trunks to make sure that they're going to go where they're supposed to go. And then he gets on an omnibus, which is a large carriage, and rides with some friends and supporters over to the train station, the Great Western Railroad Depot, just a few blocks away. It's still standing in Springfield. And it's a cold winter morning, February 11th, 1861. It's the day before his birthday. And it's drizzling. The drizzle's beginning to turn to snow, though. And when he gets there, he's surprised. There's a pretty good sized crowd there to see him off. And so, they're friends and neighbors and supporters, old clients. And he realizes he needs to say goodbye. He needs to say something to him. So he steps up on the back of the special train that's come to take him to Washington, and stands on the rear platform there. And he gives a little short, impromptu farewell address. And I'm going to close things out here by reading that address to you, because it's just like six sentences long or something like that. So I'm going to just read it to you really quickly. His farewell address in Springfield. He says, "My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I may return with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you as I in your prayers hope you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell." And with that, he goes inside the train, and it pulls away. And it is the last time that Lincoln is ever in Springfield. And with the exception of a few friends and associates that go to Washington, to see him in the White House, it's the last time the people of Springfield ever see him alive. The next time they see him, he will be coming home in a casket in 1865. So we will leave Lincoln. We'll leave old Abes. He goes chugging off down the tracks to Washington to try his hand at being the president. If you want to know the rest of the story, you know where to find it. I have to do a real quick commercial for my novel Old Abe, or my publisher will be very angry with me. It's called Old Abe. It is a novel. It's a historical novel, and it basically just tells the story of the last 5 years of Lincoln's life. So it starts in the spring of 1860 with that Decatur convention, and you're at his side every chapter, every scene. You're at his side as he goes through the presidency and the Civil War. So you're with him for iconic events like the Gettysburg Address and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and you're also with him for a lot of lesser known moments that make a life in full, like the times he stands over wounded, looking down to the faces of wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederate soldiers in hospitals, or the time he tries to dash inside the blazing White House stables one night because they catch fire, and he tries to save his boys' ponies and their pet goats to keep them from burning up. So I tried to make it. I wanted to do it as a novel, because I wanted to really try to bring him alive as a walking, talking, breathing fellow, not just that stiff image we see on the penny or the $5 bill. But I wanted to make it an accurate portrayal of him and what really happened. So I put a lot of research into it, and I hope it's a accurate portrayal of what really happened. So I hope if you read it, it will bring him alive for you. And I hope if you read it, that it will remind you and help you understand what an extraordinary service he performed, because he really was the giant hero in that epic struggle to save the country, to defend our founding principles, and of course, free millions of enslaved Americans. I think that you understand the American story a lot better if you understand Lincoln's story, because in many ways, I think he stands right center stage in that great American story. So that's my commercial for the novel, and I've gone on plenty long enough, I'm sure. So I'm not sure how to get myself out of back end. Oh, there. All right. Can you see me again, or are the slides down now?
I can see you.
Good, good.
Great. John, congratulations. It's a fabulous book.
Thank you.
Certainly achieved your goal of bringing a rather complex man, Abraham Lincoln, to life. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think everyone who reads it certainly will. Several things have come to mind as I read the novel, and I'm kind of anxious to hear your thoughts. Before Abe was elected, there were concerns about his being an abolitionist, and he and his supporters were worried about trouble, revolts, so forth. And he made a comment to his law partner, Billy Herndon, and I'm quoting this from your book. Look on the bright side, maybe I won't get elected. How concerned do you think he really was? And did he perhaps at that point wish that he had not followed that path?
I think there probably were, yes, times when he wished that he had kind of not stepped into the tragedy that he stepped into. It was a very tough 4 years. They got to Washington and just were almost immediately surrounded by death and destruction. The first Union officer killed in the war was a friend of theirs, Elmer Ellsworth, young man that they had known in Springfield. Not long after that, a very good friend of theirs, Ned Baker, is killed at Ball's Bluff up near Leesburg in Virginia. And then it just went on and on and on. So yeah, I'm sure there are times when he just thought, when he thought back on his life in Springfield, and he never got to go back to Springfield after he was elected. A couple of times he wanted to, he just couldn't. He felt like he couldn't. But I know there were times when he thought, I wish I could be back in Springfield. And yeah, as you mentioned, there were concerns even as he went into office about, was he an abolitionist or not. He was in fact what was known as an anti-slavery man, which Lincoln's view going into the war was that it would be better to restrict slavery to the southern states, not let it spread out of the southern states. And if it could be restricted to the southern states, it would die a natural death, is what his view of it was. And that's really what triggered the war.
Well, another thought, the train ride to Washington took 12 days. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, there were stops in lots of towns along the way, and he'd get out and shake hands and speak and so forth and so on. But there was news of an assassination plot in Baltimore.
Yeah.
Will you tell this story and just tell briefly the new plan to get him to the White House in the Capitol?
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. They get to Philadelphia and they pull him aside and say, "We got to talk to you. There's a serious threat of an assassination in Baltimore." And of course, as y'all, I'm sure, Jane, and a lot of your viewers probably know, Baltimore was kind of a hotbed of secession activity during the war. Right. And so Pinkerton, the famous Chicago detective Pinkerton, had been on the case and had uncovered this plot. And he said, "It's serious." And he said, we need to change your plans. And Lincoln, with some talking to, agreed. And so they basically they take him off of the inaugural train, and without telling anybody, and they put him on another train and basically sneak him into Washington through Baltimore. He goes ahead of Mary and the rest of his family, and they sneak him into town under cover of darkness to get him past this assassination plot. I think Lincoln later on regretted it because he took a lot of criticism and the opposition, the newspapers, especially the opposition press, kind of ridiculed and made fun of him for sneaking like a coward into Washington. But that's the way he started his presidency, was sneaking into town. Yeah.
Well, as you alluded to when you were speaking about your book, Abe kept feeling that the war wasn't going to last long, that this really wasn't going to be a big deal and that it would be over quickly. Can you just briefly describe his relationship with General George McClellan and some of his other military leaders and how he managed to persevere with all these issues? It seemed to me really, I don't know how he slept.
I don't need it. I think a lot of nights he didn't sleep.
Right.
And if you look at photographs of him as the war went on, like many presidents, he ages, quickly those 4 years. His relationship with McClellan is very interesting. He knew McClellan a little bit before the war because McClellan was I think he was president of the Illinois Central Railroad Company, or maybe vice president. And McClellan was a Democrat, and when Lincoln had debated Stephen Douglas in those Douglas debates, McClellan had loaned Stephen Douglas his private train car to use, and so Lincoln, he knew who McClellan was. But anyway, when he first brought McClellan on, he had high hopes for him, and I think the whole time he liked McClellan. He was fond of him, but he gradually came to realize that McClellan was a great organizer, but not a great fighter. And after the Battle of Antietam, up not too far from y'all, Lincoln, McClellan, when he's being very, very slow about pursuing Lee's army, Lincoln decides finally, I'm going to get on a train and get up there and see what's going on. And he goes up to Antietam, which I think is, by the way, the most beautiful of all the Civil War battlefields in Maryland there. Antietam is just gorgeous. And he, spends some time with McClellan. He sits down with him. I know some of y'all have seen the famous tent of him, the image of him sitting in the tent with McClellan, and he has almost a father to son talk with him. And he says, George, I have to tell you about a character flaw that you have that you may not be aware of. And you can imagine McClellan kind of, because McClellan is pretty self-confident guy. And he says, you were brilliant at getting ready for a job. Nobody in the world is better than that. I'm paraphrasing. But when it comes time to doing it, there's something in your character that makes you hold back to completing the job and going to battle, basically is what he's saying. And so anyway, they have this almost father-son talk. And I think during it, Lincoln pretty much concludes this, I'm going to give him another chance, but it's probably not going to work. And of course, he ends up relieving him of command after not too long after that. Yeah. So Grant, when he finally brings Grant on, he watches Grant from a distance out west. Grant's in charge of the armies out in the Western Theater, and he watches Grant and he realizes this is a man who knows how to fight. And once he gets his teeth into something, he does not let go. He's like a bulldog, he says. And so he eventually brings Grant east, of course, to take over.
Well, another really interesting thing that I found, Abe's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, she was obviously an extremely strong woman and very supportive of him, and
Yes.
and definitely pushed him along as far as being the president. But the pressures of her role as the first lady and tragedy of the loss of two sons and so forth in a short time, she really seemed unable to cope. And I think this was obviously a problem and was hard on him. But she turned to spiritualists and seances. Mm-hmm. And he found out about that and sat in on one of these. Could you just briefly describe that? I found that really kind of fun and interesting.
It's a fun chapter, isn't it?
Yes. I enjoyed it.
Yes, she, Mary, as you say, I think especially after their son Willie dies in the White House, it's kind of it's a straw that breaks the camel's back. Right. She was strong in a lot of ways, but she, it was so hard on both of them. Lincoln, in one way, was fortunate in that he had this job. He had to do this. He had to be president. He had to focus on the war. She did not have that. So in that respect, it was harder on her. But anyway, yeah, you're right. She turns to spiritualism, which was very popular at the time. And so when he, when he realizes this, he kind of thinks, I better kind of look into this and see what's going on. So they arrange for a seance, a spiritual, consultation in the White House. And so that chapter is based on reports of that session plus other ones. I also drew on articles and reports from the time of other seances to put together this. They go in and they all put their hands, and Lincoln takes one of his private secretaries, John Hay, with him, and he takes the secretary of the Navy in with him, Wells. And they all sit around this table and they put their hands on the table, and the medium comes in. Nellie Coleman is her name in the chat. This is one of the times in the book where she's actually a composite of more than one medium that Mary Lincoln had consulted. Her name is very close. One of the mediums that she had consulted, I think her name was Nettie rather than Nellie. I just changed it a little bit because I was introducing some new elements. I wanted to change it a little bit. But anyway, she communicates with generals and statesmen of the past, and which alarms Lincoln a little bit that Mary's getting political advice and how to run the war through this woman. And so, but after it's over, in this, in the book, Lincoln, he sits down with Mary, and he doesn't try to disabuse her of it, because he realizes this is the way she's finding comfort and peace, and that's okay with him, I think. And you also have to realize that Lincoln himself was a pretty superstitious guy. He grew up on the frontier where dreams and portents and were people took that stuff seriously. So there was probably a part of Lincoln himself that wondered, there may well be something to this.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Abe had a very keen knowledge of the Bible, and he read it often, and he apparently was a man of tremendous faith and obviously compassion. And although he didn't really belong to any church, or he wasn't really a church goer, and he was never baptized,
right?
But he seemed to look to God for support and answers throughout his entire life. When he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, and I quote again, "I can only trust in God. I've made no mistake." Mm-hmm. You have any comment on that?
Yeah, you're exactly right about all of that. He may have known the Bible better than any president before or since, or at least as well. He quoted it all the time. His famous phrase, for example, "a house divided against itself cannot stand," which he used to describe the country before the Civil War. That's straight from the Bible. That's Matthew 12:25, where it says, "No, every kingdom divided against itself will fail, and every house and city divided against itself, none can stand." So that the Emancipation Proclamation, he, right after the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, he called his cabinet together to tell them that he was going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And he gathered them, and he had met with them about it before, but they were waiting for a victory. And so he brought them together and said, "This is the time." And he said, he told them, he said, "I made a solemn vow to God, a solemn promise to God that I would do this." And he also told him, he said, "God has decided this issue in favor of the slave." So clearly he had been in conversation with God about this. And of course, Lincoln viewed himself, as he put it, as a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty during the war, that God was using him for his purposes. He believed that God was taking a direct hand in human affairs. And he came to the view, which he stated in the second inaugural address, that the Civil War was basically God's way of judging and punishing the nation, both North and South, for the sin of slavery, because he felt both sides were responsible. And that, in effect, he says all this bloodshed is God's way of cleansing the nation of that sin. So it's a very, very interesting view. And as you say, he was a man of deep faith. I think he found, in a lot of ways, the strength to make it through the war by through his faith and spending so much time with the Bible.
So you spoke just a minute or two ago about dreams and whatever. Abe had a recurring dream, and they seem to predict important events to him. And he believed that his dreams had meanings, but this recurring dream was one of those last dreams, that recurring dream, which he shared with Mary and some others. Do you think that was a prediction of his own death? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it seems like it was. He didn't see that. So he has this dream of being on a vessel of some kind and gliding across the water. And there's a distant shore in the off ahead of him, but the shore kind of keeps receding as he doesn't get closer to it. And he tells people he has this dream before important events, important battles like Fort Sumter and other battles in the Civil War. So the last day that he's alive, he meets with his cabinet and with General Grant, and he tells them, "I've had this dream last night." He said, "I had this dream," and he tells them about it. And he says it always comes before important news, and he thinks that it's a signal that Joe Johnson, who has the last Confederate army out of the field, Lee has surrendered, but Johnson is still in North Carolina with a large Confederate army. And he says, "I think this is a sign that we're going to get news that Johnson has surrendered to Sherman." He says that's the only thing of importance that can happen in the war. And of course, that's not what happens that night. That night he is assassinated. So he doesn't see it as a prediction of that, but it's looking back at it, it makes you wonder.
It does. It did me. I was just wondering, if that were a possibility.
Yeah.
Would you speak to the relationship that he had with Frederick Douglass? I found that an interesting point.
Yeah, it is really, isn't it? Frederick Douglass, of course, the great abolitionist, and they have one chapter in particular where Frederick Douglass comes to Lincoln to see him in the White House. It's really an historic meeting in August of 63, I guess. Is that right? 63, maybe 64. And Frederick Douglass comes to him to complain because he's been out trying, at Lincoln's request, out trying to raise troops, African Americans, to fight in the Union Army, which is a very potent weapon for the North. And at first, Lincoln was reluctant to use Black people in the armies. He was worried that frankly, he was worried what the reaction would be from the Union troops. But they form some units, and the African American units fight very, very bravely, very heroically. And so they're raising more of them. So Frederick Douglass is out trying to raise these troops, but he comes to Lincoln. He says, "Look, I'm having a hard time because we're being discriminated against. I'm trying to convince people to fight, but you're not paying them as much as you're paying the white troops. You're not giving them the promotions that they should be getting, and or the allowance, and the allowances." And so Lincoln, in effect, agrees with him, but he just says, he just basically counsels patience. He says, "I'm doing the best I can. Just have patience." And it's hard to tell somebody who's right to have patience, but that's what he does. Later on, Frederick Douglass comes to hear Lincoln give his second inaugural address, and that evening there's a big reception in the White House, and Douglass comes to the White House. At first, he's turned away because he's Black; they won't let him in. But a congressman comes to Lincoln and he says, Douglas is here and he's trying to get in. And Lincoln says, let him in now. And as Douglas comes across the room, Lincoln says in a loud voice so everybody can hear him, he says, here comes my friend Douglas. And Douglas comes up and he says, what did you think of my speech? And Douglas kind of demurs and says, well, you don't want to know what I want to think. And Lincoln says, no, I definitely want to know what you think. And Douglas says, Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort, he says. So the relationship between Douglas and Lincoln was sometimes hot, sometimes cold. Sometimes Douglas got frustrated that things were not moving fast enough. But in the end, he was I think, a great admirer of Lincoln.
I actually have one final question for you. You did an amazing amount of research on this. I know you visited battlefields, you've read biographies, first-person account. I know it. How, after all the years of all this research, how did you actually pare it down to? I mean, it seems like an amazing job to have condensed all that you had come up with into this wonderful book.
Well, the short answer is I way overrode. I wrote way more than I needed to. My original idea was a book that would start with him as a teenager on the Indiana frontier and take him all the way through the end of his life. And as I wrote that, and it got bigger and bigger and longer, it turned into this giant, 1,000-page James Michener book. I realized it was too unwieldy for me to handle and probably to sell to a publisher. So I cut it. I just started cutting it, and I really broke it into 2 books. And the second part is what you have. I basically cut it in half, and then I took that half, and of the second part, and I just cut it. And it was those years, those last 5 years of his life were kind of a natural selection, because there's a natural beginning point, his nomination, and there's obviously a natural end point, his death. And so that made sense. If this book does well enough, I'm hoping to then go back and do a second book, which would be the first part of his life, which would begin with him as that teenager on the Indiana frontier living in Little Pigeon Creek, and take him up through the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And that's basically the story of just how he got from the middle of nowhere to the place where he was on the verge of being able to run for the presidency.
Well, I thought it was absolutely amazing. And I found myself reading longer than I probably would have, just because I wanted to see what was going to happen next. So you did an amazing job of keeping your reader engaged.
Thank you so much.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not sure whether Lisa is coming back on and whether she's.
There she is.
You want us to keep on talking, Lisa? I'm fascinated with John. He's wonderful.
Well, sure. I think maybe some of the comments might spark some additional dialogue between the two of you, and that's fine. First thing we have is Deb wanted to let you know what great visuals she thought you had in your presentation.
Thank you.
And then we also have from Lori. She is curious how you decided to make this a novel versus a biography with so much factual information on it. And the reason she asks is actually because she herself is a novelist and has written about the Lincolns around the same time frame. And she's got a plug for her novel in here. It's called Star Spangled Scandal. So she's very interested in why you chose the path for fiction versus nonfiction.
All right, I'll have to check out Star Spangled Scandal. Thank you. They say there are more books written about Lincoln than anybody else in history except Jesus Christ. About 10 years ago, somebody started counting the Lincoln books and got up to about 15,000 books, Lincoln books. And I think he stopped because I think they're more than that. And of course, in the last 10 years, there've been even more added. Almost all of them are nonfiction. The overwhelming majority are nonfiction. So that's number one, is that there really are, several really fine nonfiction biographies of Lincoln out there already. I'm not sure the world needed mine. But in the end, first of all, I always wanted to try to write a novel. I majored in English in college. So I've always wanted to try to write a novel, but I really wanted to try to bring him alive. And as we know, you know, fiction can do that in ways that nonfiction just can't. So that's really why I wanted to try to tackle a novel. Yeah, to try to bring him alive. Yeah.
Oh, Lori thanks you for that answer. And then we also have a couple of comments, both from Lori and also Francis out there, that they've purchased your book and they can't wait to read it. Really looking forward to it.
Thank you.
I actually had a question about how you all envisioned Lincoln's campaign running today, with Twitter and social media being such, such areas for discourse in our society.
Well, I tell you, not to tread too far into current politics here, but Lincoln, I'm not sure he would have been on Twitter too much. Lincoln was famous for, although maybe he would have. Lincoln was, one of the things he did was when he got hot under the collar, really got angry with somebody, sometimes he would sit down and write a really blistering letter to them. I depicted this one time in Old Abe. He writes General Meade after Gettysburg. He writes him a famous angry letter because he's frustrated that Meade is not moving to chase Robert E. Lee, and he basically says you've wasted this golden opportunity. He basically almost accuses him of treason, basically. And then he reads it over and realizes, I probably shouldn't send this. So he just seals it up and he writes never sent on it, and he files it away. And he did that more than once. So he would not have been one to sit down and just fire off Twitters on the spur of the moment. However, I will say this: Lincoln was a genius at going around the press to get his message to the people, or to get his message directly to the people. He worked very hard to cultivate relationships with editors, but he would have his speeches not planted, but make sure they appeared in newspapers where he wanted and when he wanted them to appear. And sometimes even kind of ghost wrote some articles that ended up in the newspapers. So he was very good at going around to what you would call the mainstream media to get his message directly to people, which of course is what social media, that's the way politicians try to use social media now, right? Twitter and Facebook, and to get their message right straight into people's phones, I guess. So maybe he would be using social media after all.
Maybe he would be more of a TikTok guy.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe so.
And then one final question for you, John. What is your next project here?
Well, like I say, if this book does well enough, I would love to do the first part of his life, where he's out on the front. In a lot of ways, it's the most fascinating part of his life. He grew up out in the middle of nowhere. He had all kinds of adventures. He rafted down the Ohio and Mississippi river to New Orleans, and then he rafted again down the Illinois River into Mississippi. Did it twice. There are all sorts of great stories about him out on the frontier as he was growing up. And then, as I say, just the story of how he got from a log cabin to the place where he was, right ready to run for president is an amazing story. It's a great coming of age story. It's a great story of perseverance. So I'm hoping that I could do that book if Old Abe does well enough.
That sounds neat. That would be fun to read.
Thank you. I hope it happens.
Would it be a novel as well?
Yes.
It would be. I mean, it wouldn't be a straight biography. You would.
Yes, it would be a novel. I actually have the manuscript is there. I mean, it's kind of the remains of. Remember, I said I wrote this big, huge, long thing. It just needs a lot of editing and reshaping and massaging. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to it.
Oh, thank you. I hope it comes to be. Thank you.
Well, John and Jane, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and it was a wonderful conversation, a wonderful presentation about Lincoln. I think lots of folks learned some things they may not have already known, and especially with the timeliness with the campaign of that time versus what we're all experiencing today. It was a fascinating look at politics of the past. John and Jane, thank you so much again. And we hope you both join us again sometime here from Carroll County Public Library and the Likely Story Bookstore. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Lisa.